Hi guys, Brook Potter here. In this video, we're continuing my series about the ministry of Jesus. And we're going to be examining something that is not explicitly taught within the Bible, but nonetheless had huge cultural significance in the ministry of Jesus. And I'm of course talking about the Oral Torah, or what's known as the oral tradition within Judaism. Now, with that said, I need to address a few things about the written Torah, or the Law of Moses. Now, the first thing that I want to address about the Law of Moses is the fact that the Law of Moses was never God's original intent for the nation of Israel. When God first called the people out of Egypt and invited them to come up on Mount Sinai to meet with him, God's desire was such that he would be their God and they would be his people, and everyone would have direct access to God. But on the morning when God descended upon Mount Sinai, we have it recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verses 23 to 28. When the elders saw the spectacle in the smoking mountain, they came to Moses privately, saying that at this point they'd heard God's voice and they had not died. But they wanted God to stop talking to them continuously because they feared that eventually he would turn on them and they would all die. At that point, the elders instructed Moses to go up and meet with God, get the rules, bring them back, and the people would thereby obey everything that the Lord commanded. Now, this is important to understand because this is a reflection of Israel's desire for a lesser covenant or a lesser relationship with God. They'd reduce the relationship to God with that of one of blessings and cursings. Now that's important because later on it is this change in the relationship that the New Testament writers would thereby say the law served as a veil, hiding the true nature of God from the people. Now the second thing that I want to address is actually something that I've been guilty of saying in the past and even in previous videos. But the fact is that the law of Moses was not impossible to be kept, although unlikely that anybody actually kept it. Moses himself attested to this in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 30 verse 11. And we know also that Jesus Christ in his earthly ministry did everything as a man, and he walked out every point of the law perfectly, satisfying the demands of the law once and for all. Now the reason this is significant is because when we say that the law was impossible, and as we said earlier that there are consequences in the form of curses for breaking the law, we paint a misrepresentation of the Father, adding to what the New Testament writers call that veil that distorted his true nature. It would be the same as a father giving his son an impossible task and at the same time punishing his son for not being able to perform that which is impossible, and creating this image of a monster or psychotic father. And again, we misrepresent the Father when we say these things. So these points need to be cleared up so we could better understand what's going on in the ministry of Jesus. Now, the last thing that I want to address is actually found in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 31 verses 22 to 30. Moses is about to die and the children of Israel are about to enter the promised land, and Moses calls the nation before him and he gives them a prophecy concerning them, being Israel, about what was going to befall them in the latter days. The prophecy itself is recorded in Deuteronomy 32, and it's sometimes known as the Song of Moses, where God recounts his relationship with Israel, but goes on to say that they would become so corrupt, such as Sodom and Gomorrah, and they would be so disobedient to their part of the covenant that God was going to unleash judgment and destroy them as a nation. Now again, it's important to remember that the covenant is not a reflection of God's heart, but it was reduced to one of blessings and cursings. So God, being the faithful to his side of the covenant, was bound to be their punisher in the event of their disobedience. It is not a true reflection of God's heart. Now with that said, I would like to examine what developed in that time frame leading up to first century Judaism when Jesus came onto the world stage, and what I believe contributed greatly to the fulfillment of Moses' prophecy, which I believe happened in 70 AD with the Roman armies destroying Israel, destroying Jerusalem and the temple. So with that said, let's start to examine the Oral Torah, or what's also called the oral traditions of Judaism. One of the ancient traditions within Judaism in the first century was the idea that there are in fact two Torahs. There is the written Torah, which comprised of the 5 books of Moses, but the tradition also believes that God spoke many oral commandments unto Moses, laying the foundation for what would be known as the Oral Torah. Now, For the first 1500 years of Judaism, it was actually forbidden that these traditions would ever be written down. The Jews instead relied on the close relationship between father and son and rabbi and disciple to pass these oral traditions from one generation unto the other. Now, we don't have exact evidence as to where this belief started, but we do have evidence to suggest it existed at least a few decades before the time of Christ. The Oral Torah was birthed out of ancient Judaism from the belief that the rabbis and the religious leaders had absolute authority on how to interpret Scripture. Their interpretations were thereby seen as infallible and considered to be on the same par as the spoken words of God. Now, the rabbis' authority was so unquestionable that many of them went on to enact their own rules and their own laws, speaking on behalf of the governing of the nation of Israel. Now, there's a great deal of debate as to how these new laws and new regulations are to be categorized, but they generally fall into one of three categories. Firstly, there are what's called the fence laws, or building a fence around the Torah. These laws were designed to keep the average Jews from breaking the law. An example of that would be things concerning the Sabbath and not being able to work. An oral tradition was such that a Jew could not even pick up a hammer or handle money or even pick up a pen or a pencil in fear that the Jew would forget that it was the Sabbath and engage in work, thereby ending up breaking the Sabbath. Other such categories of the oral traditions included edicts that have been passed for the welfare of all Jewish people. For instance, the post-biblical holiday of Hanukkah was in fact passed by rabbinical edict. Similarly, customs that have been performed for many generations have now been elevated to the point of Torah. Things like the Jewish men wearing a skull cap. And again, there is no precedent for that or any written law allowing that. Now, somebody might ask, well, what is the problem with some of these oral traditions? And generally my response would be, well, there really isn't anything wrong with that, except for the fact that Deuteronomy 4:2 actually makes it clear that the Jews were not allowed or permitted to add anything to the law, neither were they allowed to say anything to diminish the law. So while many of these enactments are probably very benign and have no real consequences, there were many enactments that actually contradicted the law and found creative ways to break the written Torah. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 13, we see where God actually issues a command to Israel that if any of them swear a vow or offer an oath to perform, they're to do so swearing on the name of their God. We see all throughout the writings of the Old Testament where the men of faith, such as Joshua and David and others, actually made promises and vows in the name of their God. However, the practice became outlawed due to the oral traditions, trying to protect the Jews from using the name of God in vain, invoking the breaking of blasphemy. However, even to this day, when Jews write words that are not even the name of God, such as God or Lord, they still omit letters in fear that they might be actually breaking the commandment of blasphemy if they use the Lord's name in vain. The problem is, in doing so, they're now breaking the commandment of God, which says that they should use God's name when swearing an oath or making a vow. It is these types of oral traditions that actually brought Israel into continuous disobedience to the law of God and brought them in danger of national judgment. The oral traditions of the sages found creative ways to break the law of Moses and allow Israel to remain in disobedience to their half of the covenant. Now, it is not limited to simply spelling errors and spelling omissions. Some of them actually get quite perverse. In contrast to Moses, who once said that a woman that had sexual relations with an animal was to be put to death, or the writings of Leviticus that say a priest cannot marry an unclean woman, many of the sages actually said that if that was actually enforced, there wouldn't be a woman for the high priest to marry, and thereby allowed women to live, and not only live, but for the high priest to marry a woman that had sexual relations with animals. The oral traditions allowed for all sorts of sexual perversion, including incest, bestiality, and even sex with underage children. I believe this is a large part of the traditions of men that brought Israel in danger of national judgment when Jesus Christ arrived on the scene. In the book of Galatians chapter 4 verses 4 and 5, we learn that Jesus' original ministry was in fact to the Jews living under the law. Now, that's not to say that he had no significance for the Gentiles, but we get that revelation from Paul later on. A large part of Jesus' ministry was in fact to confront a lot of these traditions that had brought the nation of Israel and Jerusalem to the verge of national judgment. We see this distinction between the commandments of men and the commandments of God recorded in the book of Matthew chapter 15 verses 1 to 3, where the religious leaders are criticizing Jesus and his disciples for not washing his hands. In this dialogue, we actually see the distinction between the rabbi's desire to uphold the traditions of men versus Jesus' desire that he would uphold the commandments of God. I believe this is a large part of what we see going on in the ministry of Jesus, confronting the religious leaders constantly for adding laws to the commandments, making it impossible for the people of Israel to actually obey and upkeep their part of the covenant. Another place in Scripture where Jesus had to directly confront these oral traditions is recorded in the book of Mark chapter 7 verses 10 to 13. In it, Jesus describes how Moses gave the commandment to honor thy father and mother, in other words, take care of them as they got older. He then goes on to describe that the oral tradition had found a way around that, allowing people to give the money that was meant to take care of their mom and dad to the temple instead as a gift known as a korban, thereby finding a way to circumvent the commandment of God and at the same time making the religious leaders richer in the process. Over and over again, Jesus rebuked the religious leaders and their oral traditions. He accused them of shutting up the kingdom of heaven or even laying heavy burdens upon people that making it impossible to obey. Now remember, the original law of Moses was not impossible to be kept. But when you add to that centuries of oral traditions and rabbinical edicts, it had grown into something that was impossible for the average Jew to actually perform. As a result of that, Israel was now in disobedience to their side of the covenant and in danger of the curses and the subsequent judgment prophesied by Moses. The oral tradition is a large part of why Jesus was constantly quoting the law and teaching the law back to the nation of Israel. In the book of Luke chapter 11 verse 30, there is a parallel to the ministry of Jesus going to Israel with that of Jonah the prophet going to Nineveh. In both cases, the nations had slipped into apostasy and they were now in danger of national judgment from God. I believe that the oral tradition within the context of ancient Judaism played a large part in allowing Israel to remain in disobedience to their side of the covenant and bringing about what was prophesied by Moses as their coming destruction. Ultimately, Jesus Christ was rejected by the religious leaders and they used the Roman forces to crucify him. But not before in Luke chapter 13 verses 34 and 35, Jesus himself spoke the final judgment and sealed Israel's fate as the destruction of Jerusalem was foretold. In 70 AD, the Roman forces surrounded the nation of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and the city. And I believe that was the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32. So again, I hope this brings a little context to the ministry of Jesus and understanding some of his judgment languages, as well as understanding why a large part of his ministry was in fact to teach the law back to the people. The oral traditions are not recorded very clearly throughout the scripture, but they played a heavy cultural significance in that first century Israeli setting. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you know anybody who might benefit from this teaching. Thanks again for watching, guys. God bless you, and I hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.